Okay, thank you everyone. I'll be presenting the first part of the webinar content, followed by Michael and then by Jen. So I'm going to start by referencing our context before and then during and then after October 7th, 2023. It may seem obvious to review our local context, but it is often helpful to be reminded that we are not alone in how we react to a collective stressor. This can be normalizing. Prior to October 7th, many of us may have naively taken for granted the safety that we perceived in our day-to-day life in Toronto. Many of us, frankly, existed within the security of our community bubble. Some or all of us may have been settling into the post-pandemic reality, adjusting to renewed social engagement, returning to normal occupational expectations, and a more typical pace of life. Some of us relished this, while others may have felt burnt out from the pandemic juggling act and continually challenged by the shift in thinking and feelings brought about by the prolonged pandemic and associated restrictions. On October 7th and almost every day since then, for many of us, it has felt like the sky has been falling in. Not only have we been trying to make sense of the massacre, the kidnappings, and the ensuing war, but we've been dealt with a double whammy when you add the rising anti-Semitism that has touched many of us. For most of us, the past 2 months have been the most stressful period of our lives, a time when the way that we navigate the world has been deeply challenged. For each of us, these cogs work together in different ways, but we may all be impacted by the confluence of a post-COVID reality, the events of October 7th, and rising worldwide anti-Semitism. I'm grateful that psychological language has made its way into popular culture. However, it's important in this context to differentiate between trauma and stress. Stress is defined as any uncomfortable emotional experience accompanied by predictable biochemical, physiological, and behavioral changes by the American Psychological Association. Trauma, by comparison, is a diagnostic term defined by directly experiencing or witnessing actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And this is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. Stress is common. Trauma exposure is less so. Of those who experience a diagnostic trauma, only a small proportion go on to experience post-traumatic reactions. Research has taught us that most people get on with life following the trauma and helps us to understand why some may be more vulnerable and others more resilient. This can include exposure to previous traumas. While there are some people who can develop post-traumatic reactions to prolonged stress, again, most people will be able to get on with their life over time. When we experience short or long-term stress, we typically experience changes in the way we think or make sense of the world, how we feel or react emotionally to seemingly typical stimuli, how we behave or interact with our partners, children, family, friends, or colleagues, and how our body or physiological health responds. While the cause of the stress may be common, how each of us reacts in terms of our thinking, emotions, behavior, and physiology may be different. Some people may find that they overestimate the probability that bad things will happen, feel intense anxiety, bunker down at home, repeatedly check the news for updates, and find it difficult to sleep, and experience low energy. Others may feel saddened by the gravity of the situation in Israel and the local rise in anti-Semitism, feel sad, blue, or helpless, withdrawn from social interactions, social media, and the news, and find that they're sleeping more and unable to complete daily activities. A few might feel defiant and dig into their democratic rights, increasing pride in their Jewish identity, seek out opportunities to get involved in their community and in advocacy, and feel energized and hyper-focused. For many of us, we might cycle between these reactions depending on the day or circumstances. As we come together to normalize our collective stress and learn how to cope with this ongoing crisis, it is important to recognize that how we cope with our own reactions can help us to help others, our partners, our children, family, friends, colleagues, and community. How we learn to make sense of what is happening personally can help us to help others. Strategies that we use to regulate our emotions can be used to support our children, What we do to cope can be taught to others. Stress management and relaxation can become community and family activities. I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Maya. I'm going to be talking about the information that kids are getting, having open conversations, and helping young people process the information that they're getting. In an ideal world, as parents, we would be the ones sharing all of the information and would have control over the information that they're getting, but that is not the world that we live in. So when it comes to access to information, we need to consider social media, what they're hearing at school, what they're hearing from peers, what they're hearing from teachers, what they're hearing from the news, and what they might be hearing or overhearing from your conversations. Where are they getting this information from? And then how do you help kids understand what they're seeing, hearing, and reading? Understanding that if your kids are in school, that if they have access to smartphones and the internet, you can't control their access to information. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but as parents, you need to help them understand. This is where, as parents, we want to ensure that we're using our active listening skills. Next slide. Thank you. So LAMPS: listen, ask, mirror, process, and safety. We'll start with listen. So listen to what your kids are saying and show that they're listening. Show that you're listening by making eye contact, nodding, using your facial expressions, staying silent while they're speaking, and ensure that your devices and all other distractions are put away for that conversation. So that's the first step. The first is listen. Then we move on to ask. Be curious. Ask questions like, where did you learn that? How did it come up? Open-ended questions are really good here. What kind of feelings does this give you? What are the pros and cons of this situation? What kind of information do you want to understand this further? Then we move on to mirroring, the M. Continue to use facial expressions and body language to reflect their feelings. Validate their feelings using your words, or even using the words that they've used. That sounds scary, or you must be worried. And use a measured response based on their age. Then we move on to process. Help them process some of these thoughts and feelings by having open conversations. Allow them to ask their own questions and lead the conversation. Let them know that you're taking their fears seriously. Normalize what they're going through and what they're feeling. And then we get to safety. Let them know that you're glad that they came to talk to you about things. And then use measured responses and age-appropriate responses and see where they're at. This conversation is for them. It's not for you as parents. It's to help them process and figure out what they're feeling. So when we talk about age-appropriate conversations, next slide. You know your kids best and use this as your starting point. So things to use as a guide. How do you speak to them about things like death and loss? How do they respond to themes of death or loss or violence in movies, TV, or books? Think about what they're asking. So again, this is about what they're asking and what they need, not necessarily what you need or what you might want to share with them. Question what their understanding is of things like hate and war and oppression, and how do they respond to those things? And can you relate any of these stories back to our shared history, the shared history of the Jewish people? And can you relate any of those stories back? Next slide. Finally, I encourage parents to conclude the conversation in a positive way. So reassure them that although we're hearing terrible things, most of the people in the world are good. Be really proud of them for coming to you and being open and sharing their feelings and asking their questions. Encourage them to continue coming to you and having these conversations. Focus on resilience and empathy. the way that people have been resilient through this situation, and the way that people have shown care and empathy. Ask your kids how they want to show their support. Is it going to a rally? Is it volunteering? Is it learning more? And then highlight stories of bravery, kindness, and resilience. Jen, on to you. Thank you.
So I love this quote. It's from Rachel Redman, and the quote is, "The expectation that we could be immersed in suffering and loss and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet." So really what this message is saying, we're not living in Israel. Well, majority of us, we are here in Canada, but we are all affected in different ways, either by watching the news, people we know in Israel, things that are happening within our own community, right? Some of the rallies, the violence. And so it affects each and every one of us in very different ways. And it's very important to acknowledge that while this is going on in the world, and it's going on in Israel, and what's going on in Israel, it does impact us. And the reason why it's important to recognize it, because if we don't recognize the impact, then we can't do anything about it, or we can't do anything to help ourselves. So that the first step is really to understand how we're all affected. Next slide, please, Maya. So what to do, caring for the caregiver. And that's really, really important as parents and as adults, maybe adults who work with children, if there's any teachers here, to be able to take care of ourselves. Next slide, Maya. So I don't know about you, but I often have a hate on for airlines. I'm sure we've all had our nightmare experiences. Last year, I didn't get to go to my trip because everything was shut down. But you know what? The airlines really know what they're talking about. And so on a plane, one of the first things they do is the flight attendant says to put the mask on the adult before you put the mask on the child. And the message is, if you don't take care of yourself first and you lose oxygen in an emergency, you will be unable to care for your child. So you need to put, and I think as a parent, our first inclination will be to protect the child, put it for the child first. That's our natural instinct. But actually, we have to put the mask on first to protect ourselves, so then we can help our child. And it's very much the same idea with psychological mental health for parents. So I'm looking at a holistic self-care plan, and anybody who's on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, it's been all the rage to talk about self-care, and you always see memes of people in bubble baths with candles, and that's self-care. That is not self-care. That is maybe one little aspect of self-care, but is much more complex than that. And there's different parts of self-care that we use at different times throughout the day and throughout the week and throughout the month. And it's a holistic, okay? So it's not just taking a bubble bath with a candle. And the reason I'm kind of joking and being a bit sarcastic about this is because the problem is when people see these things and they think, well, I'm engaging in self-care. I took a bubble bath and I had a glass of wine and I lit a candle, and kind of not feeling that much better necessarily, because there's many different areas that we need to engage in order to care for ourselves. And so one of them is functioning, and functioning actually means our eating. So what do we eat? So when we're stressed and we're overwhelmed, I don't know about other people, my go-to is a bag of chips, especially 11 o'clock at night with Law and Order or House. That is not so healthy. It's about what do we put in our bodies. It helps really take care of how we feel about ourselves. It's about exercise and fitness and activity. It's about having fun. And I'm going to talk about that because I'm sure a lot of people are feeling, some guilt. And I've heard people feeling badly about celebrating Hanukkah when people in Israel have had so much loss and there's still people kidnapped, and feeling guilty having celebrations and parties. Faith and religion and spirituality, focusing with respect to mindfulness, and really sometimes just sitting still. And I sometimes very strategically turn off my phone and will not go on social media in order to just focus and sit and be present and not look at all the noise that's going on. Focusing on our feelings and recognizing, how do we feel about different things? Why are we feeling that way? And also friends and being part of a community and network of people. You can turn the slide. So functioning. So as I said, what we eat is very important to our self-care. Maybe this is a very bad thing to be talking about after I've eaten about 10 latkes tonight and Hanukkah and eating donuts. But on average, we really, one way to be able to, and this isn't just a matter of since October 7th, but actually in general, to be, a healthy parent, we need to really take care of ourselves. And I know as parents, we often feel guilty when we do things for ourselves. And so I really try that when I do things for myself and instead of feeling guilty about doing things for myself, I think I'm actually doing it for my child's well-being. Because if I'm not a strong and healthy parent, I can't be the best parent that my child needs. So very careful about what I put in my body as far as eating. Exercise is, in my opinion, a necessity for each and every person. I recommend it to all my clients all the time. One of the big things I ask is, do you exercise? What do you do? And again, with respect to exercise, it's different. Everyone likes different things. So I would never subscribe that one person has to go spinning, or one person has to walk, or someone has to weightlift, or someone else has to do Zumba, but any movement that elevates the heart rate. There's a lot of research that shows that when we exercise at a high enough intensity, at least 3 to 4 times a week, we are actually releasing endorphins, and those are the chemicals that make us feel good. So there are many times when people are very stressed, very overwhelmed, maybe they don't want to go to the gym, maybe they feel like they don't have time, but when they go, they always feel better because it's actually a natural sort of happy hormone. And there's a lot of research that shows exercising in any capacity does reduce stress, and it reduces anxiety and depression. Sleep also is very important. Oh, sorry, back up. Sorry. Thank you. Sleep is also really, really important. Again, I know it's very easy. Lots of people, we get lost in social media. There's like that term that everyone's using nowadays, doom scrolling, where, finally their kids go to sleep and they lie in bed and they start scrolling. And I have to admit, we're all guilty. I've gotten lost down the Twitter rabbit hole before bedtime, but it's very, very important to consciously make an effort to go to sleep at the same time every night and to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And I know there's not a client and a person that I don't meet that doesn't have difficulties with sleep. I think on average, most people struggle. I know since October 7th, it's been particularly challenging. I know people with young children, it's even greater challenge. But to make efforts to sleep as much as possible, because again, the research shows that when we are sleep deprived, it impacts our emotion, and it impacts our ability to contain our emotions and to manage our emotions. And so in order to parent effectively and to be able to help our children during this difficult time and to help ourselves, we need to be the best self we can be. And to be the best self we can be, we need to be well rested. And so I go, and again, I'm a psychologist. Yes, I have a degree. I'm human like everybody else. There are moments where I go to bed way later than I intend to, but I make a concerted effort that I'm going to get into bed, if possible, by 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, turn off the TV, turn off everything to get a certain amount of sleep that I need to be able to function. And that's one of the key things for mental health for everybody. Next slide, Maya. So who's in your sphere? I want everybody to really think about who is in your sphere. When I say in your sphere, who's in your community, your network, how you stay in connect with people. Do you go for dinner? Do you have Zoom calls? Do you text message? What do you do to connect to people? Because it's really, really important. Just being on social media is not necessarily a connection. And how are you staying connected? And especially during times of stress and upheaval, and particularly now when there's all the anti-Semitism going on, it is really important to connect with people that we feel safe with, that we can talk to. We need to pay attention maybe to people in our sphere that we think maybe are at risk or maybe struggling. And if you think you have the capacity to reach out to them, to think about why you're worried for them, and just to sometimes touch base. I've been thinking about you. How are you doing? We all like to get those messages from time to time. Next slide, Maya. Spirituality and faith. And again, everyone has different levels of connection and spirituality and faith and religion. Sometimes it can be an actual religious connection and praying and going to synagogue, or I've noticed I'm on Everything Jewish Toronto, more and more people talking about lighting Shabbat candles, lighting Hanukkah candles, wearing kippas. Some people have turned more to religion. Some people maybe are not particularly religious. Maybe they don't necessarily believe in God, but even just a connection with a community. Because at this point in time, we all have a very shared experience, and having a sense of community and connection with community can be a real buffer and a real support for our mental health. Next slide, please. So one of the things I like to say all the time is very important. Be gentle with yourself. We all have moments that we are not perfect. And so that's okay. Even if you maybe were short or raised your voice a little or had a little less patience, it's okay. And you can always say to your child, I'm sorry, I was distracted. Sorry, I got caught up in something. It's okay. You can just make a repair. And that's actually a really important lesson that you're modeling to your children, how to make a repair. You're a parent. You're not a magician. You are also going through your own things. It's important to find space every single day. I know in 2 weeks, winter vacation is upon us, and everyone talks about like taking a vacation and how important a vacation is for mental health. I have to tell you, I unfortunately am not taking a vacation, but I actually like to tell everyone I take a vacation every day, multiple times a day. So if I go spinning for an hour, that's my vacation. If I watch house for an hour, that's my vacation. When I throw a football with my son, that is my vacation. Doing little things every day that bring pleasure and joy is a vacation. And I always tell everyone, build in a vacation multiple times a day, whether it being, I'm not a huge meditation person, I know people are, but finding that calm and the solitude, right? To enjoy, where I'm throwing a football and I'm not doing anything but throwing a football. That in and of itself can be a vacation. Give support and encouragement to people in your circle whenever you can. And it's very important to try and accept it in return. And I know a lot of people have a hard time accepting when people do nice things for you, when people invite you over, when people give you a kind word or offer help. And again, that's something that takes practice, and it's okay to do. And it's really important. The other thing is to really try to focus. And again, this is something you need to work on, and we all need to work on finding one good thing that happened today. And there's always one good thing, whether it's just a chit chat with 5 minutes with the person at the Starbucks, or, I got an extra, I don't know, or was at the Starbucks, there was an extra coffee that someone didn't want, and then I brought it to work to someone else. And I thought, oh, that was really nice. There's always something nice. If we look for it, we will find it. So it's important to try and focus. It's very easy to focus on the hostages, on the bomb threats, on the war in Israel, on the death toll. And I do think of those things all the time, like everybody else. But it's important to also fill our brains with positive things. And there are positive things when we look for them. Next slide, please. So I'm giving you all homework. I'm not a teacher, but I like to give homework. That's what a psychologist does. I want you all, and I think it's an important thing to do, is think about what are your pieces of your self-care plan. Okay. Not one piece always works all the time for the same person. We need, what I say is a bag of tricks. So I might do this one thing now in this moment at this time, but at another time at a different day, I might use a different part of myself. We need multiple. We need about our eating, our health, our sleep, our relationships, our connection to community. And I want you to write a list of all the ways you can take care of yourself. Because as parents, if we don't care for ourselves, we're not going to be as effective as we want to be for our children. Next slide. Or is that it? Oh, that's it. There we go.
We're going to move to our question and answer. So there is a question and answer section at the bottom of the panel. If you have any questions, those questions will only be seen by the panelists. So feel free to submit any questions that you've had throughout this session. I should have told you that at the beginning. But I'll throw out a couple of the questions that have been submitted already. So some people have asked about age-appropriate conversations, and I think starting off with, how do we have age-appropriate conversations with kids, different ages, when things feel overwhelming for ourselves and maybe out of control? So how do we instill the sense of safety and build that what you had talked about, Michael, this like the positivity and resilience when we're feeling sort of out of control or afraid ourselves?
So I think that when we're feeling that we're feeling out of control ourselves, I think about a lot of what Jen was saying, that we need to sometimes or oftentimes put our kids first and take some of what we're feeling and thinking to ourselves, I'm going to deal with this later. This isn't about me right now. This is about providing safety and security for my child, and trying our very best to put our thoughts and feelings aside in that moment so that we can provide that safety, calmness, security for our kids in answering that question.
I think
Maya
if it,
or Jen?
sorry, if I think in the moment, if someone is feeling particularly distressed, they may not be able to effectively answer in the way in which they want. And it's okay to say to kids, you know what, that's an excellent question. I really want to talk about this. You know, can we talk about it in a little bit? I just need a few moments, or I need an hour. I want to give you a good answer and I just need some time. And it's okay to take a break and a time out and to really think about it and give yourself the space first to manage your emotions before you speak with the child.
Thank you. So then once you then are having the conversation, and we're talking about children of all ages from preschool to elementary, high school, and possibly university, so they're exposed to different things, talking about, you know, what's going on in the world and rising anti-Semitism and being like why Jews are being targeted, how to explain war. These are sort of a lot of different things, like talking about the hostages. Like, how do you broach those topics? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can start. Thank you, Hani. I think one of the important rules of them is that you don't want to base a response or a conversation on any of these topics on a child's chronological age and say, oh, well, you know, 7-year-olds, you know, need this level of information. I think thinking about some of the content that Michael shared, you need to know your child best, know their strengths, their limitations, their reactions to previous scary pieces of information, movies, etc., and really gauge what they need to know and what would be appropriate for them to know. being mindful that we live in communities. And so what we may think is appropriate to share with them, they may actually learn some of the other pieces in the playground or at school. So just to be mindful of those two slices of things. Michael, Jen?
It's interesting. I was having dinner the other night with some teachers, and I started like probing their brain because I knew we were having this talk tonight, and I was curious. They elementary school teachers, and I asked them. I said, "What is your experience like? What's going on with the younger kids, or grade 2, 3, 4? You know, what do you see and hear is going on with the children?" And the teachers told me that the kids are actually not talking about it and are really on average just going about their daily life at school. And it's not, and so what I suspect is that as parents who love our children, we are probably maybe more concerned about the impact on them than the impact actually is. And so it really struck me. The teacher told me that the day after there was some discussion, and then I can't remember why. And then I asked the teachers, I said, well, what do you think? What are the kids saying about all the police officers and all the security around the schools? I'm talking with teachers from private Jewish schools. And the teacher said to me, they said, the kids don't even think twice about it. They're kind of used to always having security, and it doesn't seem to bother them in the least bit. And there's been no worries and no concerns. So that's not to minimize, because I know some children might be more anxious than others. But I also think we just really very much worry about the impact on our children. And I wonder if it's maybe not as significant, or this is what the teachers were telling me. It doesn't seem to be what they're talking about in the schoolyard.
Again, I think that it comes down to taking the lead from the kids, and having them bring up the topics, creating an open space, an open environment where they can feel like they can bring things up, and then allowing them to be the ones to bring up the conversations rather than us pushing conversations on them.
Oftentimes, sorry, honey, oftentimes when we deal with stressful experiences, we often, get really worked up about mitigating risk and, minimizing post-trauma reactions. And, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, of the vast number of people who are actually exposed to trauma and stress, a very small proportion of them go on to develop psychological consequences of stress. And so I think we underscore how resilient we are as people, and kids especially. They're these magical sponges of resiliency that I think we under expect.
Often, sorry, honey, I'm going to jump in again.
Please
Often,
continue.
I have parents will come to me and say, my child has been through so much, been through, separation, divorce, and switching schools and moving homes, and talk about all of these things that they've been through, and they want to meet. And I think it's great, and I think it's wonderful that parents are opening their kids up to therapy. And then we have a couple of meetings, and oftentimes the kids are doing fine. As adults, we see these things and we think it's going to have such a huge impact. But like we've talked about already, kids are very resilient and can move past things. So again, great that parents are opening up therapy and opening up the conversations and making it available to kids. But just because as adults we experience something and feel it really big, doesn't mean that kids are also feeling it really big at the same time.
So after you've had these conversations, one of the tools or suggestions that you made was, what are things that they can do? So some of the questions were, how can we engage, teens to be more active in volunteering or advocacy? Or even the more personal, what are some things when children are worried, even if they have family in Israel, or, they're worried about what's going on, to help them de-stress when they are worried? What are some suggestions?
I would suggest, really embracing that phrase that Michael used, and that's really allowing your kids to take the lead in having the conversations, but also in determining what to do when they are worried, because every kid is going to need something different. For some kids, feeling helpless or feeling concerned, I'm thinking about high school and university aged kids, they may want to get into advocacy or getting involved in their community. And for others, that may be too much. They may not, based on their personality, be comfortable being an advocate. And so I think you really have to let your child take the lead in terms of what actions they're willing to take. Obviously, I'm talking on the action side because you mentioned advocacy, Hani, as some of the questions did. But when it comes to, managing worry about family overseas or, the state of Israel, a lot of our kids have personal connections, is again using the knowledge of your children. So I shared an example earlier when we were chatting about my 7-year-old. My father lives in Israel and he's very worried about his grandfather. And what was effective for him is being able to say to him, I'm glad we're having these conversations and keep talking to me. But what I can tell you is I speak to Saba every day and I will take on the responsibility where I can to tell you when there's a need to worry. Otherwise, and until that point, I'll hold on to the worry. And for him, that was effective because I understood what he needed. So I don't think there's a magical answer that works for everybody.
No, but I think it's also important to, validate if they feel worried, right? And to question, right? My own child was asking if the terrorists were going to show up here in Toronto. And then he was thinking about it and he said, well, that's really stupid. He goes, why would they take a plane and come all the way here? And which I thought was very sweet and naive. And I had all sorts of other thoughts that I didn't vocalize because they weren't appropriate. But, and I asked, I said, why do you think you're afraid? Like, what do you think would happen? And try to get a sense of, I think it's really important. I think we all have the tendency to fill in the blanks because we all just want to fill in the blanks. And I think it's important to ask, like, why do you think that? What do you think will happen? It's okay to say, what do you need to feel safe? Like, what can I do? Like, if you don't know as a parent, because we don't all have magical answers, as I said, we're not magicians, what would help you feel safe? Sometimes kids know what they need, right? And so ask them directly, what can I do to help you feel safe?
Okay. So I want to go back to some questions of safety and anxiety. And for the parents themselves, I know we did talk about it, but maybe you can touch on it even more or again. When the parent, the adult, is having a hard time feeling safe, physically safe, with all like the repeated threats against Jewish schools, and a sense of a feeling of a lack of response from leadership here in Canada or in Ontario or in Toronto. So what are some ways that the adults can navigate this uncertainty and fear? Oh, and sorry, I'm just going to tack on to that. And when we are feeling unsafe, how do we navigate the decisions in terms of what to allow our children to do and making decisions for their safety?
I can start. I think one of the tendencies, and this is a whole new domain for many of us, given that I highlighted at the beginning that this may very well be the most stressful experience that many of us have ever endured. And so we don't have a template for how to navigate this. And so one of the tendencies when we're feeling anxious, and the textbook definition of anxiety is feeling that you don't have the resources or the capacity to endure a stressful situation. And so it's an underestimation of one's own capacity to endure. But oftentimes what happens when we're feeling anxious is that we overestimate the probability of bad things happening and our inability to deal with them. And then we start to become worked up and catastrophize. And I use that term gently, not critically, that when something happens, we start to think, well, what happens if the next thing happens and the next thing happens, and building upon each other. And I think, as I'm going to take something Jen said and flip it around a little bit, Jen referenced, every day we need to try to find one good thing to hold on to, is that we have to remember to step back with all of the awful information like bomb threats and police officers outside of schools and command centers and issues on the TTC, is that most days there are none of these incidents. And actually these incidents are in the minority. And so we have to step back and look at all of the data, not just the negative information, and then almost put a denominator on it, so that helps us to get some perspective. Because when we're feeling anxious, it starts to lure us to all of the awful things that have happened and can happen. I think we also have to remember context. And while there are unprecedented things happening in our local communities that we don't have a template to deal with, I think we have to remember that we're still here and we're not in Israel on the front lines of the war, and that the odds of really, really bad things happening in our local communities where our minds goes are probably still very, very low.
I like to think about setting our kids up for safety, or so when setting our kids up for success, putting things in place for safety. So if they do want to go to a rally, what are the things that you're going to help them understand or have in place for them to help keep them safe? Make sure that their phone is charged. Make sure that they have, the right clothes for the weather. Making sure that they have some food and snacks and other things like that. So when setting them up for success, ensuring that you're also thinking about their safety in these situations and helping them go and to do those things successfully.
And so I think one of the last questions here I have is, so kids who are experiencing or going to be kids in like high school or university campuses who are hearing these conversations all the time and are facing the anti-Semitism, or are just sort of bombarded with the information outside of the home, so you're not able to control it. How do we prepare children, either prepare them for these conversations that they're very, very likely to have or experience or witness, and how to help them cope with the stress or the anxiety that might come out of those experiences?
Yeah. I mean, my personal bias is really being quite honest and forthcoming, especially with 17, almost 18-year-olds going off to university. I think, again, similar to what Michael's saying, important to help. Sometimes people don't know where to go to get support. So really connecting. So for example, if someone was going off to university, connecting them with a local Hillel, a Chabad, someone who lives, if they're moving to London, Ontario to go to Western or wherever they're going, to connect them with maybe, second year students. If they, if you have friends who have a year or two older children that are already living there, to try and connect them with people ahead of time so that they have a connection of go-to in the area if they're leaving home, for example, right? If they're leaving outside of Toronto. And I think that's the important thing, because I think naturally people on average don't turn to connections or resources, especially children, like they don't, or teens don't seek out people, or they don't even think about it, or they don't know where to go. But if you can set them up with someone that can help them, or that they can turn to, like, hey, the rabbi in this place, here's their phone number, or, this my son's friend is third year in da 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 da. Here's his number if you need anything like this, or make a connection, invite them for dinner or something. That's really helpful, I think, when dealing with that situation. But having the discussion, because it is quite possible they're going to face it. But what are they going to do when they face it? And are there going to be people, if they're not at home, that they can turn to for support? And obviously they can always call you, but I mean people in the immediate vicinity.
I love that, that Jen. And, you know, from the perspective of preparing our adolescent and young adult children for these challenging conversations, you know, what I'm going to say is relevant to us as well, as adults and parents, is it's really being able to understand and to read an interpersonal situation, so that you can tell the difference between a healthy dialogue and when you're edging into unsafe conversations, and also being able to read who is someone that I can have this conversation with and lean into my understanding of history, and when is this someone who isn't really interested in having the conversation, and then how do I disengage from that conversation. And one of the most important learning skills is that, you know, when someone is strongly of an opposing opinion, they're unlikely to be able to hear what we have to say. So how do we disengage and walk away safely in those circumstances? So having, you know, some preparatory conversations to that extent is helpful, especially for our kids who are in Jewish day school and used to being surrounded by more like-minded individuals.
Yeah.
Building on what Maya is saying, I think it's important that our kids know that they don't always have to be an advocate, that in order to be an advocate, you have to feel safe first. And so, again, it's about recognizing, is this a conversation that I can have healthy, safe dialogue engagement, or is this something that I'm gonna walk away from feeling worse? And if that's the case, it's not a conversation that anybody is going to get anything positive out of. And we want our kids to be able to focus on those positive experiences.
So the last two questions. So second to last, when you do have children, I guess, or you know, your teens, whatever age they are, in your under your roof or in your circle, and you're able to help them. One of the questions was how to prevent vicarious trauma. And so what does that mean, and how do we make sure that we are giving them an appropriate safe space to protect them to a certain extent from the awful things that have been happening?
Well, I think, unfortunately, again, it's about talking with them, you know, especially when they're 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and they're on the internet and they're on TikTok. Like there are things like even someone I know put something on and I'm like, oh gosh, why did you do that? And it was pretty gruesome. And, but it's about having a conversation about what is healthy to see on the internet, what is not healthy, why it's not healthy. And so I think that's, you know, and I think aside from October 7th, this is a conversation I have with parents always. And I think it's a conversation to start really from a young age with all children about what they expose themselves on the internet. And there's a lot on the internet that actually can be quite dangerous and not good for their brains. So it's, you know, you can't really control once they're 16, 15, 16, 17, but you can have a conversation about why they shouldn't be viewing this material that is online.
So two other points that I wanted to add. The first is encouraging your children to be their own advocates, that if they're exposed to something that they feel is inappropriate or that they don't want to see, and this is a hard thing, especially in social situations where people are sharing together or talking together, but to give them the confidence with which to say, I don't want to have this conversation, or I don't want to look at this video or this image, because I think that that's really important across all different types of topics. The other thing as parents for us to be mindful of is when it comes to vicarious trauma and kind of long-standing psychological impacts, there's something about firsthand experiencing something that is very different than viewing it when it's not about you or directly related to you, that is protective. So I hope that makes sense, that when we're observing images of things that are happening far away, even if they're happening to our people and we feel affected by it, it doesn't have the same imprint on our personhood as if it was happening to us or we observed it happening directly to someone else. So I just wanted to highlight that as well.
Can I just add to that, Maya? You made a very good point about kids sort of being able to say, like, I don't want to see this, or please don't send this to me, or you don't want to be part of a discussion. And I find sometimes kids, and I love that. And I think sometimes those some kids don't have that ability or they're not comfortable to do that. So you can always coach your children where they have to go to the washroom or they have to go do something, like give them an excuse, like help them come up with an out to get out of a difficult situation if they're not comfortable. Like some kids are not able to say no or, have those boundaries. And I think just giving them sorry, I have to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. And let them just extricate themselves if they don't have the assertiveness to sort of say that.
And so last question is, you mentioned at sometime during the presentation that, it's Hanukkah, there's lots of things going on in the world that are also good, and it can be really hard to find the joy, and there's a sense of guilt that some of us might have when so much is happening in the world. And so can you give a little tip for us before we go, to hold on to those good things and to try to stay in the moment of those positive experiences and really hold on to those so we don't feel guilty?
So I love that question. And I think that never before have we needed to give ourselves permission more to lean into the normal. I have a brother who is in the IDF, and very early on in the conflict, he took a stance of really caring for his family, and he sent each of us a message, and he said, you have to lean into the day-to-day routine, because that is how we show our enemy that they cannot win. And so for me, that has been a very poignant message that I actually look up periodically at his exact words, because it's almost like a directive from my brother on the front line to me, what he needs us to be doing as Jews in the diaspora and, even outside of the direct conflict in Israel. So that's, a strategy that has helped me. But when I pass that message on to other people about, the meaning of, leaning into the day-to-day normal, but also enjoying Simchas and Hanukkah and all of that, is that's how we persevere.
Thank you very, very much. Michael, Maya, Jen, we really greatly appreciate your time and giving us all this really helpful information. The webinar is being recorded. It has been recorded, and it will be shared in a follow-up email. Thanks everyone for joining tonight, and we hope it was a helpful discussion.